Exhale you heard from the East Coast came from Philadelphia, where the Flyers finally ended their franchise record losing streak. Rachel Donner of Locked On Flyers will join us to discuss how this feels for the team and where they go from here. All that and more coming up on the Locked On NHL podcast.
Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast. So glad to be with you. Gil Martin here, as I am every Monday, and a familiar face joining us right now, my co-host every Friday, Rachel Donner of Locked On Flyers. And Rachel, how was the weekend?
Much better than previous weekends have been. You did mention the Flyers finally snapping that 13-game losing streak. Very first win of the year 2022, if you can believe it. Was the last team in the NHL to get a win this calendar year. So it's been a little depressing, but I think that win felt really good.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be a load off the players' backs. This had to have been building, and they did it in dramatic fashion, no less.
They did, but I think that it was a little bit nerve-wracking just because, the Flyers did have a lead and the Kings tied it up with less than a minute to go. Anze Kopitar got one with the extra man out there at the end of the game, and you could just feel the "oh no, not again" creeping into everybody's thoughts. And luckily they managed to win it in OT. I think the biggest contributor to the success of the team in that game was Cam Atkinson with a couple of goals in the game, and he's just been such a bright spot in this season that he's continued to be successful. He plays hard every single game, and he's so much fun to watch. So it was absolutely thrilling to have him contribute to 2 goals in the game and got an assist on the overtime winner.
Talk to me about Carter Hart and how he played in that win, because he came up with some pretty big saves.
He really did. Man, both goalies actually played really well in that game. You got to give some stick taps to Jonathan Quick as well. The Flyers got 36 shots on goal. The Kings 40 shots on goal. So both netminders were pretty busy this game. And yeah, but again, Carter Hart has been keeping the Flyers in games that they shouldn't have been in during this stretch, and playing really well. And, the team just has to catch up with him and not hang him out to dry as often.
So psychologically, I mean, what does this mean for the Flyers? Where do they go from here now that they're off the schneid, so to speak?
Well, it's an interesting question. And, my co-host and I, Russ on Locked On Flyers, have been talking about that quite a bit in the last week or so. And there's a really good segment on part of it on today's show for Locked On Flyers, where the next 3 weeks are such a downtime for the team, where the Flyers only have 1 game this week. They have 1 game the following week and 2 games the week after that. So not a lot of opportunities to gain points, but there's also downtime, and you want to be able to keep up at, game readiness level. And how do you do that? So I think, for the Flyers, it'll be a lot of figuring out how to make practices really effective, work on the things that they have been not executing well, and then just keeping their mentality at that game ready level.
Obviously, the team has struggled through the last month and really through a lot of this season. Who are some of the younger players who have stood out, who have, by their play this year, sort of made themselves part of the future of this franchise?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think there have been some of the young guys that have gotten chances because of injuries and COVID. on this team. And I know that's been the case, across the league, but I think the Flyers especially have gotten hit with the injury bug. I mean, Kevin Hayes has been out most of the season. Ryan Ellis only played 4 games for the Flyers this season, and Sean Couturier is out long term now. And so, especially with Couturier and Hayes, the Flyers have been pretty weak down the middle. And so that has given players like Morgan Frost a bigger opportunity to spend more time up with the Flyers. Cam York has been out there for the last several games on the blue line for the Flyers. And I think the two of them, as far as the younger players go, have been the ones to establish themselves the most. I would give an asterisk to Max Willman, who is definitely a bottom sixer in the NHL level. But I think, he does the work and he puts in the time and he can contribute out there. And then, there's some veterans that normally would have been at the AHL level for the duration of the season that have made a small impact, including Jerry Mayhew, who's gotten 3 goals in the last stretch of games, kind of unbelievably. But he's works really hard, and at the AHL level, he can be a dynamic scorer. So he's just benefited, I think, from the fact that the Flyers have been so banged up.
Claude Giroux, really the face of this franchise to a lot of people. How does this season affect his attitude, his future with the team, and just sort of where he's at?
That is the elephant in the room, I think, for the Flyers right now, in that he is still playing excellent hockey right now. He's the team leader on the scoreboard as well right now, and you can just see what he's putting out there every shift. I love him out there with Atkinson, by the way. I think the two of them play really well together. And, in the grand scheme of things, I think that ultimately, like what Chuck Fletcher said last week is absolutely true. This is a decision that's all in Claude Giroux's court.
And do you have any indication of where he's leaning, or does the rest of this season have a lot to do with that? Where do you think he goes?
I think it's partially what happens with the rest of this season, but it's also, where he is in his life. And if he thinks that the Flyers have a good future over the next couple of years. I think if he thinks if it's more than 2 years from now, then maybe he'll want a chance elsewhere and decide to pull the trigger now. But again, the ball is absolutely in his court.
So, what is the plan from management going forward at this point? Because obviously the playoffs this year are very unlikely,
Mhm.
barring a complete turnaround in the second half. Uh, what does management put forth as their plan right now?
I think if I was management, I would be trying to figure out what you have in your prospects and rotating them through at the NHL level just to see, what kind of chemistry might be there, what kind of skill might be there, can they hold their own, what are the ceilings of these guys, and then kind of go from there in terms of figuring out what your approach will be at the trade deadline, who you want to hold on to, who's expendable, and what can you get for them, and kind of go from there. I think that's the right approach.
And going forward, right now for the Flyers, how has the fan base responded to this losing streak? What's their take on this team right now?
I mean, it's been pretty rough, I will say. There have certainly been a certain level of, I would say, disgruntled is the word I would use to describe. And I think it's just because there hasn't been a ton of success over the last decade. And that's a long time to go without a real shot at a Stanley Cup. And, we went through a significant rebuild under Ron Hextall, and it seemed like all we needed was a little bit of a retool at this point to get to that next step. And for whatever reason, I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but I think that, they just have not been able to take that next step with the combination of players and coaches that they've had in the last couple of years. Now, have they had extraordinarily bad luck? Yes. Has COVID upset everything? Sure. But at the same time, other teams have managed to turn things around in certain ways. I mean, you look at the Pittsburgh Penguins, they should not be doing as well as they're doing, but yet somehow they are. They've found a way to have a really successful run of things right now. And it's hard to not look at that and be a little upset and jealous at the same time.
Rachel, why don't you tell our listeners and viewers where they could find you on social media and where they could find both your podcast and what you do here for this podcast?
Yeah, of course, I'm on the Friday show for Locked On NHL. I'm on Twitter at @rmiriam, and Locked On Flyers is on Twitter at Locked On Flyers.
All right, Rachel Donner, always a pleasure, and glad to have you here today.
My pleasure.